Okay, good afternoon. I think I can start. So the session today will be about PSD2 and open banking, and the goal here is to explain how open banking is working in the UK and show a demo of how the PIN identity stack can be deployed and work to enable banks, financial institutions in general to comply with the open banking specification. So my name is Federico Carbone. I'm a solutions architect at Ping Identity, and in the past 12 months I've worked to understand how our software stack can help financial institutions to open up their banking APIs. So obviously I think you already know what PSD2 is, but in essence it's about opening banking data to third parties. So PSD2 mandates that financial institutions across Europe provide a way for exposing the account data to third parties applications that want to consume that data. The only problem is that they do not specify how. So it's a directive, it's a very high level directive. They do not mention anything about how the data should be shared. The only country in Europe that has done anything in that direction is the UK, via the Open Banking Implementation Entity. So the Open Banking Implementation Entity actually defined the functional APIs, the specification of the APIs to expose that data. So I do want to transfer money, yeah. What API shall I call? What data shall I send to the API? What data do I get back? Do I want to aggregate transactions data? Do I want to get the balance? All the functional APIs are specified in detail. So the data is defined, the endpoints are defined, and banks will have to implement that across the UK. So third parties that want to access that data, they will know exactly that each and every bank that complies implements that functional specification. Obviously we are exposing customer data, so we need to make sure that we do have a security framework. We have the security in place to protect those APIs. So open banking specified how those APIs should be secured, and also they specified how trust should be built across all the parties that in the ecosystem, right? So how can a bank trust a TPP? How can a TPP know that a specific bank is exposing some data? So there needs to be a trust framework, and open banking defined that trust framework and actually implemented the framework via a directory. So they have deployed a directory, and the directory essentially is responsible for storing and exposing all the data of the TPPs and the banks, and it's responsible for distributing and providing certificates and keys to all the parties that take part in the transactions. So we mentioned they specified the security framework. What are the building blocks of the framework? Luckily enough, they decided to use open standards. So they relied on OpenID Connect, OAuth. They extensively use mutual TLS. And because OpenID Connect and OAuth are essentially frameworks that can be implemented in a variety of ways, many of which are not secure enough for a banking scenario, they decided to rely on FAPI as well. So FAPI is a specification that essentially tries to limit the options around OAuth and OpenID Connect to make it more secure. What's the trust model? We mentioned the trust model, so we do have the open banking directory, top right, and we've got in the ecosystems third-party applications and financial institutions, the AISPs. As you can see, TPPs and AISPs, they both register against the open banking directory. They both receive digital certificates, they both receive keys, and therefore all the parties in the ecosystem trust the open banking directory. Once TPPs and AISPs have got the necessary certificates, the necessary keys, they can start to interact with each other so that TPPs can make API calls to the banks. So this is the trust model. We've said we know the protocols, we've got the APIs defined, we've got the standards defined, but there's a missing piece, which is the user consent. Obviously, we are sharing financial data as an end. What's going on? We are sharing financial data. So an end user needs to authorize a bank to share the data with a third party. So open banking came up with a three-step process, essentially. And the first step is consent. As an end user, as a customer, I start my journey at the TPP. I'm using the TPP apps. And the first step is to obtain end user consent. So the TPP application, the third-party applications, the third-party application essentially presents the screens to the end user asking for consent. So can I start a transaction with your bank, either to complete a payment or to gather your data, to fetch data about your banking accounts. So as part of, when the user actually confirms at the TPP that he's okay with the TPP approaching the bank, the TPP needs to do a couple of things. It first needs to get an access token for itself, and with that access token, it can initiate the transaction staging a request at the bank. And that's an API call made with an access token which is obtained with client credentials. After the initial call is made and the request has been staged, the user is redirected via OpenID Connect to the bank for authentication. The user authenticates there. It can be first factor and optionally Strong Customer Authentication. Once the user is authenticated, the user needs to authorize the bank to share the data. And that's the last step. As part of this last step, the bank gathers the authorization from the user and finally issues the tokens to the TPP. These final tokens are the tokens that are then used by the TPP to complete the transactions, and are tokens that are used by the TPP to make API calls to the bank on behalf of the user. So essentially the TPP has got two tokens, one for itself and one to complete API calls on behalf of the user. Okay, so this is the high-level description of the flow. And we've built a demo environment. To demonstrate these two flows. In the demo, we will show essentially a payment flow when a third-party application completes a direct payment against the bank. And there's a second application which will interact with the bank to gather transaction data from a user and aggregate the transaction data from multiple accounts. So what do we have in the demo environment? We built the payment APIs and the account APIs, and those are built according to the standard that was published by Open Banking. We do have two test applications. So the bank is called Fiducia. Then we do have two applications. One is Shopco, and that will be used to demonstrate the payment, and the other one is Finco, that will be used to demonstrate account aggregation. So what components do we have? What ping components we have in the demo environment? We do have ping access. Ping access is our access gateway that protects both the APIs and the other components in the solution. So all the calls, all the traffic, all the API calls will go through ping access, which will enforce the security policies. The second component that we've got is ping federate. Ping federate is the component responsible for orchestrating the authentication journey of the users. Once the user is authenticated, ping federate is responsible to orchestrate the authorization on the bank side, and it's finally responsible for issuing all the tokens that are needed by the TPPs. As I said, ping federate orchestrates the authorization. It relies on an external application. It's a custom application that shows all the necessary authorization screens to the user and gathers authorization from the users and enables the user to revoke the authorization at any point in time. So both ping federate and the authorization module rely on ping directory. Ping directory does three things in this environment here. It stores the end user accounts, username and password essentially for our users. It stores consent, and it exposes an API to manage consent, to create the authorization and manage that authorization in the directory. The final component of the demo is PingID. PingID is our MFA solution. In this example here, it's used to approve the payment transaction. So Ping Federate will orchestrate the authentication flow, and whenever it sees that a payment is needed, it will send via PingID a push notification to the device of the user so that the user can approve the transaction, the payment transaction. This is what we have in the demo environment. And I've got two videos here, two recordings to show and demonstrate the actual payment and the account aggregation. I will show the demo first, and then I'll show it again and discuss in detail what's happening behind the scene, step after step. So let's start with the payment. So we start at the TPP. The user is on the TPP, the e-commerce website. He's shopping as usual, and he goes to checkout. We will see in the checkout screen that he's got the option to complete a direct payment with banks in general, and he will choose Fiducia, his bank in this case. The user is redirected to Fiducia. He authenticates their first factor. After authentication, Fiducia will prompt for authorization. Essentially, it's saying, hey, customer, are you okay if we transfer that amount of money to this e-commerce website? The user confirms, and we will see a push notification on the right-hand side on the device. On the device, we get all the details of the transaction. The user approves using fingerprint in this case. Once PingID approves the transaction, then the user is finally redirected back to the website, to the TPP website, where he got final confirmation that the payment went through. Looks straightforward. This is how it will look like when third-party applications will be integrated with banks. It looks straightforward. We will see later that there are quite few things happening behind the scene, quite few tokens exchanged and obtained. I'll jump to the other video, the account aggregation. It's very similar, but again, in this case, the third party is an application that rather than completing a payment, aggregates data from multiple accounts. The goal here is just to have a unified view of all my transactions if I've got multiple accounts at multiple banks. We start with the situation where the website, the application, the Finco application is already linked to existing bank accounts at two banks, and we will show how the user can link his Fiducia account to get transaction data from Fiducia. The user starts the linking process. The TPP asks for consent, presenting the details of what data it will request to the bank, and in this case it's just transaction data. Again, the user is redirected to the bank. He authenticates there, no strong authentication in this case. Again, the consent screen here, where the user actually authorizes the bank to share that data with the third party. The user is redirected back to the website, the third-party website, and now the third-party website has got the necessary tokens that allow it to query the banking APIs. And in fact, we see that at this point in time, we do have transaction data that comes from Fiducia. Now, we said before that we do have an authorization module that is being used to get the consent and the authorization from the user on the bank side. So we also have, that module also provides a dashboard that allows the user to go back and revoke access at any point in time. So the user can go back to the consent module, see what data, what authorization was given before, and revoke access. In this case, we will show that the FinCo access is revoked by the end user on the bank side. So when the user goes back to FinCo, if we refresh the data just disappears. And that's because the access was revoked on the bank side. So FinCo made the API call, but on the bank side, the access gateway checked whether there was a valid consent given. The valid consent was not there because the user had revoked it, so therefore the access gateway is not sharing the data with the third party. So let's go back and go into the details of what happened behind the scene. So as I said, we started from the TPP, and the first step is consent on the TPP side. Okay, let's stop here. So it seems just a simple redirect, but behind the scene, quite a few things happened. The first thing was that the TPP authenticated itself against the bank to obtain an access token for itself. It used client credentials. In this demo environment here, we actually used private key JOT. So the open banking specification says that the TPP client must establish first a mutually authenticated TLS channel with the bank. So this is what the client did as a first step. It used a certificate that it was obtained by open banking to authenticate via MTLS with the bank. MTLS in our environment is terminated at ping access. So ping access, the access gateway, is the component responsible for validating the certificate. After the certificate has been validated, the private key JOT is sent to ping federate for authenticating the client. Ping federate validates the private key JOT that was sent by the TPP, and if it is all valid, then it issues an access token to the TPP. To validate the private key JOT, which is a JOT signed with a private key that the TPP has, ping federate connected to the open banking directory to download the public keys that are necessary to validate that JOT. That means, once again, that the open banking directory is actually working as the trust component in the whole infrastructure, because both the clients and the bank actually used certificates and keys that are published or provided by the open banking directory. So now the TPP has got an access token that it can use to make API calls to the bank. The first call is a call that allows the TPP to stage the request, right? So it's the initial step. It's part of the open banking specification. TPPs must stage the request first. As part of the staging process, they do get an identifier back, which is called the intent ID. And that identifier essentially will be attached to the tokens that are released afterwards. So all the tokens that are exchanged after this initial call will include information about the intent ID. The intent ID is given back to the TPP. Now the TPP needs to obtain the tokens that can be used to complete the transaction on behalf of the user. To do so, open banking decided to use OpenID Connect and request object. Essentially, the request object is another JOT which includes the intent ID and can be used by the TPP to request a token for that specific transaction, for that specific intent ID. So the TPP now creates that JOT. It's another JOT, again, digitally signed with its private key, creates that JOT and sends the request, the OpenID Connect request, to the bank. At this point, the user is actually redirected to the bank. Ping federate here on the bank side validates the request object, extracts the intent ID from the request object, and starts the authentication flow. The user authenticates, nothing special here. So username and password are validated against ping directory. And ping federate now redirects the user to the authorization page, the authorization application. So the authorization application receives from ping federate the intent ID, the identity of the user and the identity of the TPP. With this data, this module, this custom application, can call the APIs, the open banking APIs in the bank, to check the details of the transaction. So it's got the intent ID, so it can call the APIs and say, hey, give me the details of this transaction so that I can show to the end users the details of the transaction, and I can get approval from the end user that he wants to complete that transaction, that he's okay to share that data with the third party. The consent application gets the confirmation from the user. If the user confirms, the consent application does two things. One thing is that it stores the authorization within ping directory. So it stores that in a JSON object, so all the details of this transaction can be captured. So I can capture what the TPP is, I can capture what data is being shared, I can capture for how long. So all the details of the transaction are actually shared in ping directory so that they can be audited at a later stage. And the second thing that the consent application does is another call to the open banking APIs to say, okay, the user has approved the transaction. If the TPP now calls to complete the transaction, you are good, we are good, you can complete the transaction. Now, PingFeather issues an ID token, an authorization code, redirects the user back to the TPP. The TPP finally exchanges the authorization code for the access token. It checks the ID token, obviously. And with the final access token, it can make a call to the open banking APIs to complete the transaction. Now, it presents to the open banking APIs the access token that was obtained on behalf of the user, and it can query the data and get the data about the transactions. Now, it gets the data about the transactions, and it shows the data to the user. As part of that call, of that API call, we said before that ping access checks the validity of the access token, of course, and then it checks whether the access token is attached to a valid authorization. In this case, it's attached to a valid authorization. As we saw before, when the user deletes the authorization, the data in ping directory is updated. So whenever the TPP calls the API after that the authorization was revoked, ping access blocks the request, and that's why we saw that the data was not being presented. That completes it. Again, it's a very high-level overview of how it's going to look when TPPs and banks in the UK will expose the APIs and will be ready to actually get the data from those APIs. One final comment. So we focused here on the bank side, and we showed how the software stack that we provide can be used by banks and financial institutions to expose the APIs. The open banking directory itself is based on ping technology. So the ping directory is also behind the open banking directory, and we can also support TPPs as part of these journeys. I think that completes my demo, and I think we do have some time for questions if you've got any questions. Yep.
It sounded like the ID token, the OpenID Connect ID token, and access token were not delivered at the same time. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's that correct. So, well, there are actually two access tokens. So the access.
One is for the TPP
Yeah,
itself.
yeah.
But the ID token.
The ID token is sent back together with an authorization code.
Oh.
The authorization code is then exchanged for an access token.
Don't you usually exchange the authorization code for the ID token and the access token?
Not in the hybrid flow. I mean, this is an approach. So Open Banking decided to use the OpenID Connect hybrid flow, and in that case, you get the ID token and the authorization code.
Okay, cool, thanks.
Hey, just
So has the demo environment passed the open banking conformance suite for the security profile?
we are working on that. Yeah, well, we've got we are about to complete. We've got an internal deadline to complete the testing by the 20th of July. Simply because the person that is working on that is going to be on PTO after the 20th of July. That's the reason of the deadline. But yeah, we're working on it, and with the latest version of Ping Federate that has been just released, we will pass all the tests. I'm confident, at least. I'll reach out when we're done. Yep.
Can the enhancements to the Ping suite be used in other contexts outside of open banking APIs, but would desire that level of security?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so the support is there. It can definitely be used to open up APIs in general. It's used in this context for banking, but we do have, I would say the vast majority of our customers is not in the banking industry, so it can be used in many other industries as well.
So is the banking directory a dependency? Is that a centralized
Yeah.
directory? Are the security flows dependent on that banking directory, or?
Yeah, in this specific case, yes. In this specific case, yes. If for any reasons the directory is down, TPPs and banks are going to have a problem. Yep.
In your demo, you had a custom authorization application.
Yes.
Are there any plans to roll those features into Ping Federate natively?
Not in Ping Federate, but in Ping Directory. So Ping Directory today exposes the APIs to manage consent, and my colleague here is product manager for Ping Directory. So we've got plans to have an out-of-the-box dashboard to manage consent.
With the authorization step, the goal is, that is your only opportunity as the, for Ping Federate to get the user's approval to the consent is an integration with Ping Federate. So I'm working with Eric on that.
Okay.
Okay. There's nothing else? Well, I am around, so if you've got anything else you want to discuss, I will be around for the rest of the day. I'm around tomorrow. Other than that, thank you for your attention, and I'll see you around. Thank you.